Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay. Okay. Hello, gentlemen and ladies. I do not care what is in between your legs. I could not care less. I hate it when people say I couldn't care less. That think about it. Think about it. I couldn't care less. Think about what you just said. I couldn't. Oh shoot. Sorry, no, other way around. Oh no, that's me now. Um hi. Let's go. Original link to the video, top of the description, right below that link to the Discord. Click on it, send you right over there. Would love to have you. Let's do it. If you join the Minecraft thing, do not touch my throne room, please. Anything else? Fine. Just don't touch it. Don't. Oh yeah, original link to the video, top description, Discord. My name's Connor. Let's learn. I'm all over the place. I'm on number 5. Jeez.
At a young age, Catherine had been married.
By the way, I love her so far. She's awesome. Preemptive like.
At a young age, Catherine had been married to an emotionally stunted young man who never loved her. For years, she had remained trapped, until she was won over by a callous rake who later abandoned her. She then met a man of whom she was very fond, and whom she would eventually make the king of Poland. But none of these men had truly won her heart. No, the man to be her first great love turned out to be the same man who had helped her ascend the throne years before, Grigory Orlov. For 13 years, she was faithful to him, but that was soon to end.
Cap.
Grigory Orlov was brave and bold, never flinching at danger or personal risk. But he was also boorish, rude, and impertinent. He was ill-educated, with no interest in any of the Enlightenment ideas that
Despite all of my frantic movements, I would usually rewind at this point, but I have heard and followed everything.
Catherine so fancied. Catherine would once write that despite it all, she would have stayed with him for a lifetime if only he stayed with her. But Grigory sought danger. He was restless, unfaithful, and, worst of all to Catherine, he had grown distant. She sent him off on a diplomatic mission. There he failed, displaying the same arrogance that he had displayed at court, the same uncouth rudeness and sense of superiority that had gotten him hated by her nobles. But it didn't really matter at this point. Catherine had sent him away because she was already done with him. Too long had she suffered his infidelity, his harsh words, his sense that he was superior to the Empress herself. As his replacement, Catherine picked up a safe, pretty, dull young man who she would rapidly come to call the most boring man in all of Russia. She found her time with him interminable. Not because he didn't try, and not because he was unrefined like Orlov, but because he never had anything interesting to say. But then, she found Potemkin. He had first caught her attention by giving her his sword knot on the day she took the throne. He had performed numerous services for Catherine. He'd been her envoy to Sweden, bringing word of the palace coup. He had been her lay representative on the Most Holy Synod. He'd been paymaster of the army, and he'd even been appointed as guardian of exotic peoples at...
I forgot what synod means. I remember...
Catherine's Great Assembly on Laws. He had served valiantly in the Turkish War. He'd been paymaster of the army, and he'd even been appointed as guardian of exotic peoples at Catherine's Great Assembly on Laws. He had served valiantly in the Turkish War, and won himself renown at every turn. He was a cultured man, not only well-studied, but intellectually eager and curious. He had won the top honors at university, and then dropped out. He loved theology, but always, especially after being appointed guardian of exotic peoples, kept the company not only of Orthodox ministers, but also rabbis, old believers, Cossacks, and even members of the tribal religions still alive in the more remote parts of Russia. He was a great wit, known for impressions and being able to mimic people's voices, which I guess was considered high comedy in those days. He could make Catherine laugh, and through humor, he could say to her what others couldn't say. He was bold, decisive, and highly competent, and soon, Catherine fell in love with him. He was the love of her life. She probably married him. It's one of history's great decisive, and highly competent. Say to her what others couldn't say. He was bold, decisive, and highly competent.
Does that remind you of anyone, guys? Okay, sorry.
And soon, Catherine fell in love with him. He was the love of her life. She probably married him. It's one of history's great mysteries, as the wedding would have had to have been a secret, and no documents of the event survive, but in her correspondence, she starts referring to him all the time as her husband, and to herself as his wife. He was the first man who she felt was her equal, at least in everything but rank, and he was active in all aspects of court and governance, helping her to execute her will. But, and tragically for Catherine, there is always a but, he was deeply insecure about their difference in power. For all his qualities, Potemkin could never get over the fact that she could make or unmake him in an instant if she wished. That all the power in their relationship
How the turntables
was firmly on her side. Every day he required assurances that she wasn't going to leave him. When she paid attention to any of her former lovers, his jealousy flared.
Bad idea.
So certain he was that she was about to cast him aside for an old favorite. He alternated between melancholy and anger, and nothing she could ever do could convince him that he wasn't just a passing fancy, that he really was what she wanted. And in time, the strain of this broke them. Things got miserable. She spent days in tears, and he hiding in work or in another part of the palace. Passion and love were still there, but they were translated into recriminations and bitterness. At last, she finally decided to see other people.
Probably for the best.
But rather than this destroying what they had, it strengthened them. While their physical relationship was done, they maintained an incredibly strong bond that simply grew as Potemkin came into his own, not as her lover, but as her minister. Catherine would abandon lovers if they spoke ill of Potemkin, or were jealous of the space he had in her heart, and Potemkin would serve her loyally all his life, even introducing her to young men with whom he thought she might fall in love. Their loyalty to each other would overrule any whom Potemkin would serve her loyally all his life, even introducing her to young men with whom he thought she might fall in love. Their loyalty to each other would overrule any other relationship and any other concern. And from here...
So we went from crazy, kind of clingy, jealous, to they see other people and they're cool. That's cool.
Here, they could turn to external affairs. Catherine dispatched Potemkin to deliver one of the largest series of territorial gains in Russian history. As part of the Treaty of Kachuk-Kainarja that ended the First Ottoman War, the Crimean Khanate was guaranteed independence from the Ottomans, a guarantee that was backed by the might of Russia. But Catherine and Potemkin saw an opportunity. The great powers of Europe were embroiled in other wars. No one would be able to raise more than a meek protest if faraway Russia expanded her empire. And so they struck while the iron was hot and annexed the Crimean Khanate, an action whose consequences reverberate through to today. Soon after, they moved to annex the Kingdom of Georgia, and as no one had raised an objection to the bloodless takeover of Crimea, Catherine and Potemkin were sure that there would be even less objection to this expansion into a little thought of territory to Russia's south. And they were almost right. No one in Europe really did much about it, but there was one group that cared, and that was the Chechens. And so this action too would have consequences that would echo into today. Potemkin was then set to rule the south. Less objection to this expansion of Crimea, Catherine and Potemkin were sure that there would be even less objection to this expansion into a little thought of territory to Russia's south. And they were almost right. No one in Europe really did much about it, but there was one group that cared, and that was the Chechens. And so this action too would have consequences that would echo into today. Potemkin was then set to rule the south of Russia, to build cities and bring colonists into these new areas, to pacify hostile tribes and create a new and mighty Black Sea fleet. And though all of these expansions brought Russia back into conflict with the Ottoman Empire, where Potemkin had previously been but one of a myriad of generals in the first conflict, here he was supreme commander. He led with aplomb, delivering a number of smashing victories to Catherine. But shortly thereafter, he fell ill and passed, dictating only one last letter.
I was starting to like him. Why? Oh, that actually makes me sad.
to Catherine. Shortly thereafter, he fell ill and passed, dictating only one last letter to Catherine before death took him. He was a man of luxury
What did it say?
and debauchery, of unswerving faithfulness on utter profligacy, of towering ego and
Profligacy. Ah. Resembling or befitting a prodigy. Okay.
and absolute insecurity, with appetites to match his intellect and his ability. But perhaps the Austrian
Okay.
of unswerving faithfulness on utter profligacy, of towering ego and absolute insecurity, with appetites to match his intellect and his ability. But perhaps the Austrian Field Marshal Linia put it best. I here behold a commander-in-chief who looks idle and is always busy, who has no other desk than his knees, no other comb than his fingers, constantly reclined on his couch, yet sleeping neither in night nor in daytime. A cannon shot to which he himself is not exposed disturbs him with the idea that it costs the life of some of his soldiers. Trembling for others, brave himself. Alarmed at the approach of danger, frolicsome when it surrounds him. Dull in the midst of pleasure, surfeited with everything, easily disgusted, morose, inconstant. A profound philosopher, an able minister, a sublime politician.
Okay. It's kind of like me, guys. Just replace those A's with C's, because I never got A's. Sometimes I did. I was a terrible student.
Not revenge.
And I regret it. I always admired people who were good students, because that you were organized and
Asking pardon for a pain he has inflicted, quickly repairing an injustice. Thinking he loves God when he fears the devil. Waving one hand to the females that please him, and with the other making the sign of the cross. Receiving numberless presents from his sovereign, and distributing them immediately to others. Preferring presents from his sovereign, and distributing them immediately to others. Preferring prodigality in giving to regularity in paying. Prodigiously rich and not worth a farthing. Easily prejudiced in favor of or against anything. Talking divinity to his generals, and tactics to his bishops. Never reading, but pumping everyone with whom he converses. Uncommonly affable or extremely savage, the most attractive or repulsive of manners. Concealing under the appearance of harshness the greatest benevolence of heart. Like a child wanting to have everything, or like a great man knowing how to do without. Gnawing his fingers, or apples, or turnips, scolding or laughing, engaged in wantonness or in prayers, summoning 20 aides-de-camp and saying nothing to any of them. Not caring for cold, though he appears unable to exist without furs. Always in his shirt without pants, or in rich regimentals, barefoot or in slippers. Almost bent double when he's at home, and tall, erect, proud, handsome, noble, and majestic when he shows himself to his army, like Agamemnon in the midst of the monarchs of Greece. What then is his magic? Genius, natural abilities, an excellent memory, artifice without craft, the art of conquering every heart, much generosity, graciousness, and justice in his rewards, and a consummate knowledge of mankind. However you view him, he served Catherine to the end, and in the end, he was the love of her life. Before his death, though, there was one thing that Potemkin didn't get to resolve, and that was the matter of Poland. Join us next time as we delve into
Potemkin. I'm not gonna forget that name. That's well, who is it? A general that wrote that speech or something, or wrote that eulogy or whatever you want to call it. Sounds amazing and sounds like a really likable guy. Next.
Once the terror of Eastern Europe, Poland had long been in decline. Catherine aimed to make that decline permanent. When Catherine first made war on the Ottomans, the biggest losses ended up being suffered by the Poles rather than the Ottoman Empire. For years, Catherine had a puppet, a former lover, on the throne of Poland, but keeping him there, and keeping him doing the bidding of Russia, was becoming more and more difficult. Vast amounts of troops and treasure were required to keep Poland passive, and as you might remember, the first Russo-Ottoman conflict was, at least officially, caused by Russian troops chasing Polish rebels over the border into Ottoman territory.
Wasn't that Sweden? How many times did Russia chase someone into the Ottoman Empire? Is he talking about Charles XII?
But Poland was at the center of everything. Literally. The three great powers in Eastern Europe at the time were Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and in the middle of all of them sat Poland. So Poland became the solution for a very thorny problem that faced the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great. You see, Frederick had agreed to a secret alliance with Catherine, but the terms of it were very specific. You see...
So, I mean, obviously modern-day Poland, Lithuania, maybe even parts of Latvia. I'd imagine parts of Belarus, Hungary, or maybe not Hungary, Slovakia. Parts of Romania?
Frederick had agreed to a secret alliance with Catherine, but the terms of it were very specific. If either of them fought with one of the other powers, all the other had to do was provide some financial support. But if either was attacked and ended up fighting two powers, well, the other one had to go all in, joining their side. And the other terms of it were very specific. You see, Frederick had agreed to a secret alliance with Catherine, but the terms of it were very specific. If either of them fought with one of the other powers, all the other had to do was provide some financial support. But if either was attacked and ended up fighting two powers, well, the other one had to go all in, joining their side. Now, Frederick really didn't like the idea of actually militarily supporting Russia. He wanted them on his side.
But he liked the idea of Russia militarily supporting him. Can't have it both ways, Fred.
And all, but the 7 Years' War had really done a number on his forces and his treasury. And in the Ottoman conflict, Russia was being a true pain and stomping the Turks far more than anybody really thought they would, which of course worried Austria, who needed the Ottomans as a counterbalance to Russia. Naturally, this meant that the Austrians were about to join the war on the Ottoman side, which would mean that Frederick would have to do the very boring and unfun act of honoring his treaty. But Frederick was a crafty fellow. He pondered the problem and did what he seems to have usually done, and asked himself, how can I kill a whole bunch of birds with one stone? Because he really wanted a couple of things. First, he didn't want to have to send troops to fight some Russian war. Second, he wanted the Ottomans to owe him, in case he ever needed to use them against the Austrians or the Russians. And then there was this thorny issue of that big gap in his territory, making it much harder to defend. So, he proposed a solution. Rather than Russia continuing to kick the Turks around and taking large portions of their territory, what if they took a big piece of Poland instead? And then, to maintain the balance of power, Austria could go in and take the most populous parts of Poland, and him, well, he would just take this wee bitty bit over there, a bit that happened to be the most strategically important for him, and provided him more ports on the Baltic. So his
reminds you of Otto von Bismarck. Obviously, 100 years prior to Otto, or not, maybe not 100, or...
solution was proposed, and basically everybody was like, sure, that works. And so, with plenty of urging from the surrounding Russian soldiers, they got Catherine's puppet in Poland to call the Polish version of a parliament to ratify the agreement. Of course, not enough members showed up to actually ratify the thing, but that wouldn't be a problem. The first thing those who did show up decided to do was change the rules, and thus huge segments of Poland became Russian, Austrian, and Prussian overnight. From then on, anytime Poland did anything Russia didn't like, Russia would just send the troops in. Then Prussia would suggest that they all just take another bite out of Poland, until finally, near the end of Catherine's rule, everyone just agreed to do away with the nuisance that was the ever-in-revolt state of Poland. But as Catherine's life came to its close, and the last chapter in the reign of Catherine the Great was being penned, all thoughts were on one thing: the succession. And here, perhaps, for all of Catherine's triumphs, was her greatest failing, the place where her own weaknesses and insecurities show through. The tragedy of her reign was that she left behind no one to carry on her legacy. After her, Russia would never again have a truly great emperor. Her son would grow up to be like the husband Catherine had despised. When he was born, little Paul had been whisked away by the then Empress Elizabeth. For 8 years, Elizabeth had had maids and servants raise the boy, and when he was at last returned to Catherine, there was a distance between them that could never be bridged. The young man expected the warmth and attention that he'd never received during those years apart from his mother, and while Catherine tried, Paul would always be jealous of the men in Catherine's life, as she seemed to focus more of her energy on them than on him. And this was compounded by Catherine's own paranoia. She saw her son not as an assistant and
That's a little weird.
an heir, but as a potential rival, as the one person who might have a more legitimate
Get rid of
claim
him.
to the throne than she. So she kept him away from the halls of government,
No
away
minors
from
allowed.
any responsibility, from being an actor in the affairs of state. And slowly, he took to idolizing the father who might not have been his father. He would play with soldiers and march his servants around like Peter had.
Oh, God.
Catherine and her closest advisors eventually decided this had to stop, and so they sought a wife for him, hoping that being married might make him grow up. But his first marriage ended in deep tragedy. His wife died in the birth of their first son, and their son died with her. And as he was going through her papers,
That's so crazy. So I'd imagine pregnancy is terrifying, even today, when like you have all of these like you can call 911 if anything gets really bad. You can go to the hospital. You don't have to give birth with like you can get painkillers. You'll have a bunch of specialists around you getting ready to get your baby and make sure you don't get infected, and yet it's still terrifying. Imagine how much more exponentially terrifying it was hundreds of years ago and beyond in the past to be pregnant. Just knowing that like there's like a 35% chance that I just die right now, and the kid might not even. I don't know if it's 35%. I just made that up.
Paul discovered that she'd
But just like no painkillers, no like not a lot of knowledge, still a ton of mystery around it, and obviously not how it happened.
been carrying on an affair with his and as he was going through her papers, Paul discovered that she'd been carrying on an affair with his closest friend. He was laid low with grief, but he was convinced to marry again for the sake of the state. His new wife was perfect for him. She supported him, eased his anxiety. Together they toured Europe, where for the first time he was feted and treated like a ruling member of some great state. And in these few months, you can see this possibility, this glimmer of hope in the letters the rulers of Europe wrote to one another upon meeting this young man, that he might be something more than his father. Was he perfect? Well, no, but they all remark on him being capable, intelligent, and, when his wife was at his side, able to let go of the anxiety and the paranoia that plagued him. But when he returned from Europe and asked to be part of the cabinet, Catherine again dismissed him, telling him that his trip had made him put on airs. He asked to fight in the army, and she said no. On every front, she still kept him from having any of the responsibility of state. And so he sank back down into his anxiety and his paranoia. And as he grew older, rumors abounded that Catherine was going to disinherit him for one of his own sons. Now, whether she actually did or not is one of those historical questions that will never really have an answer. Some say that she left instructions in her will to pass the empire to her grandson, but that Paul had had that will destroyed before anyone could discover it. Others say that she died before she made up her mind on the issue. But Catherine, forgetting some of the pains of her own childhood, let her insecurities prevent her from giving her son the
Wouldn't you want to make many copies of your will? But then, if there are a lot of copies, then you could just change one and then not know what the real.
training or the care that he needed to rule. In the end, his paranoia became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and he would be assassinated not long into his reign. And the last days for Catherine saw other steps backward as well. The Pugachev rebellion had convinced her to step back from granting rights to the serfs, something that she had considered doing in her younger days. And now the French Revolution made her doubt all of the Enlightenment ideas that she had so loved, and that in some ways had helped her carry her country so far. She banned private printing presses, and made all works be approved by a censorship office. She even stopped the circulation of books by some of the very men she had corresponded with in her youth. And so, in the end, on the 17th of November, 1796, Catherine died of a stroke. leaving behind her a Russia that was larger, stronger, and more developed than ever before. She had championed health, maternal rights, and education. She had expanded the country on every border.
Ooh, it just started raining. Sorry.
Championed health, maternal rights, and education. She had expanded the country on every border, from Poland to Georgia to Alaska. She patronized the arts, built great palaces and wonders like the Hermitage. Under her, the army had gone from a second-rate power scoffed at in the halls of Europe to something feared the world round. She issued the first Russian banknote and brought the Enlightenment to Russia. And though she began to step back from that Enlightenment and left Russia with a dynasty incapable of completing her legacy, it cannot be said that she was anything but the Great.
I really liked her. Great series from Epic History TV. Another great channel from Extra Credits. I really liked her. She was a really cool person. And it's interesting at the end that it can make you kind of question yourself if you would always hold on to your kind of ideals, even if you had them for your whole life. That towards the end, when she knew, mortality kicks in, and she knows, and she's getting paranoid about what happens after her, then all of that gets thrown out the window, and that's I think says a lot about people, not just about her. Yeah, paranoia can make us throw out a lot of things, I guess, is the message. Not the message of the whole... Anyways, awesome, blossom, extra awesome. I hope you guys learned something or can teach me something. Enjoyed that. I love watching with you guys. I'll see y'all next time. Love y'all. Be good. Chin up. Bye-bye. See ya.